Mr. Vance goes to Germany.
Where he belongs.
Yeah.
So Vance gave a barn buster of a speech. Now, there are a lot of parts to it. We're just going to focus in on the part that really got the most attention. It got Catman, a.k.a. Charlie Kirk, very excited. It was the free speech portion. So we'll listen to that. We'll listen to about a 3-minute section of that, and then we will comment.
And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
Okay, so when they tried to refute what he said, they really made it worse. You had the German chancellor literally went on stage at the Munich conference and said straight out, essentially, that censorship of hate speech is our values. That's defending our values. You had Scotland in accusation as a confession manner, refuted what he's saying. No, that wouldn't apply if you're in your home, only if you're in your yard. Okay. All right. So yes, hey, we have reported on this kind of thing over the years. In fact, this is a video of an elderly man being arrested in England for sharing a meme.
The Hampshire police would realise how ridiculous this is.
It is ridiculous.
It is. Good. I'm glad
To come to this.
What did it need to come to?
Tell us why you escalated it to this level, because I don't understand. I posted something that he posted. You come to arrest me, you don't arrest him. Why has it come to this? Why am I in cuffs? Because of something he shared, then I shared.
Because someone has been caused, obviously, anxiety based upon your social media post. That's
not his.
why you've been arrested.
You've owned the libs in the third degree. I'm afraid subtweeting is no excuse. Just because you didn't tag the target of the tweet, it was clear who you were talking about. Subtweeting is not an excuse, sir. Now get in the car.
Your neighbor, Mrs. Marbley, just likes to put on her lipstick in that manner. It isn't your business to mock her publicly for it, sir. Yeah. So, hey, we have reported on this. There was a terrible case where an autistic girl got literally dragged out of her house by the police for saying about a police officer, as autistic people will. Sometimes they throw out Nazi salutes. Sometimes they say she's a lesbian. You just never know. And her grandmother was a lesbian. There was no prejudicial intention. And even though her mother
Right,
was
like, hey, she looks like a lesbian like my grandmother.
Right. Oh, she's a lesbian. Right. So the mother was begging them, trying to explain she's autistic. Her gran is a lesbian. It's fine. She didn't mean it like that. And just the arrogance of these people is part of the cause of the right-wing backlash that you're seeing in America and throughout Europe, and the way that they responded to it. If anyone is concerned about the implications of this right-wing movement becoming the dominant political force in the West, their response will not have done anything to give you the idea that this is not going to continue to take over one government after another, and they have well earned that. But you might notice, as surprisingly a lot of journalists that I follow who cover a lot of speech cases have even been speaking out for Palestine, a lot of people seem not to notice that he very exclusively focused on these kinds of culture war issues, the Christian praying. I bet a lot of people in our audience noticed what he didn't talk about when he talked about freedom of speech, at a later point in the speech, he talks about the freedom of journalism, the freedom of political parties to express speech that you consider hate speech. He went on really, I mean, that was probably the bulk of the speech, talking about the freedom to politically organize, even what people consider hateful, even if you consider it fascist, you should be able to organize. But
Brand burning. You mentioned that explicitly. Yeah.
Right. But interestingly, he talked about several countries where much more egregious cases of violation of free speech and the rights of journalists have been committed than what we saw with that poor old man in his driveway, as heinous as that is. So you guys probably know UK journalist Richard Medhurst detained at Heathrow under the Terrorism Act. So this is a little bit of Richard explaining what happened.
Is Richard Thomas Medhurst. I'm an internationally accredited journalist from the United Kingdom. On Thursday, as I landed in London Heathrow Airport, I was immediately escorted off the plane by 6 police officers who were waiting for me at the entrance of the aircraft. They arrested me, not detained, they arrested me under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act of 2000 and accused me of allegedly, quote, expressing an opinion or belief that is supportive of a prescribed organization, unquote, but wouldn't explain what this meant. One officer took my bags, and when I asked why he was still back in the aircraft, I was told, look, mate, you can get nicked right here in front of everyone, or in there, your choice. So I was taken to an adjacent room, patted down, my phone confiscated. I was not allowed to inform my family. Despite being calm and cooperative, I was handcuffed with something that placed my shoulders in an awkward position and my wrists on top of rather than next to each other. The handcuffs were extremely tight. Despite the police loosening them, they left marks on me for 2 days. The police took me down onto the runway, put me in a police van, essentially a mobile cage, and informed me that everything was being recorded. The van was cramped. I had to struggle the entire time to keep my balance and try not to fall over as we drove to the police station.
Okay. So that's a little strange that he's talking about England specifically. He talks about a Christian who was praying outside of an abortion center. Does not mention what I would argue is a much more serious and egregious violation of the standards of freedom of speech and certainly of freedom of the press. But maybe it's just because it was only Richard Medhurst. Oh, no. Reporter Sarah Wilkinson, arrested by UK government for opposition to Gaza genocide. A man whose T-shirts I own in abundance had a few things to say about this. Let's see what Roger said.
So, 12 cops, the old bill, come round to the house and arrest you. Sarah Wilkinson, I'm talking about now. They arrest you for standing up for human rights, campaigning against genocide. Okay, we know that these are policies that Keir Starmer doesn't agree with and Rishi Sunak didn't agree with, but you cannot get the old bill to come round and arrest people who have hearts and minds and have made up their own mind what they think about foreign policy. This is wrong. If you allow this to stand, the arrest of Sarah Wilkinson and the persecution of my friend Craig Murray, among others, then you have absolutely accepted that England is now a fascist state. 1984 has arrived and is alive and well in the United Kingdom over my dead body.
Now, this should carry some weight with Vance, because as anybody who's ever read the Hillbilly Elegy knows, he's very into the Dark Side of the Moon album. So I don't know why he didn't mention this case. Maybe he didn't catch that particular video. But it's not just England. Here we see in Switzerland, very recently, Ali Ubanima. How do you say his name properly?
Some people say, I mean, I heard Aaron Mate say Abunima, but then Blakely said Abunima. So I'm not sure.
All right. So
I said Abunima.
So let's just read this a little bit. The Palestinian-American journalist Ali Abunima was freed from detention Monday evening and deported from Switzerland after a 3-day ordeal that rights groups and UN experts blasted as a major attack on free speech. So our friend Blakely did a little video about this. We'll play a little bit of that.
Breaking news in the latest fascist roundup of journalists in Europe. Europe really not beating those allegations and recovering from World War II here. So the authorities in Switzerland, just arrested Ali Abunima, who is a journalist and the executive director of the Electronic Intifada. Was arrested by Swiss police ahead of a speaking event in Zurich. Sorry if I messed that up. On Saturday afternoon. He is currently being detained and has had access to legal counsel. The arrest came days after Abunima arrived in Zurich for the speaking event. When he arrived in Zurich airport on Friday, Abunima was questioned by police for an hour before being allowed to enter the country. Abunima's arrest appears to be part of a growing backlash from Western governments against the expressions of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Last year, several activists and journalists in Britain were arrested, raided, or charged using counter-terror powers. These include Asa Winstanley, an associate editor for the Electronic Intifada, whose home was raided and his computers and phones seized. Winstanley has not been charged with any crime.
Okay. And then not long after that, I think just about 10 days after that, less than 2 weeks, Max Blumenthal here says less than 2 weeks after Zurich police arrested Ali Abunima for planning to give a lecture on Gaza, Austrian state security escalate repression of Palestine solidarity by raiding and arresting journalist Richard Medhurst. Who or what are they really protecting? So Medhurst gets arrested again, only this time in Austria, first time in the UK. Now, Vance not only overlooked all of these, I would argue, grossly more egregious violations of free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of political organizing. He's talking in Germany. He overlooked this every place else, including in the country that he's in. Let's take a look at how they honor free speech in Germany itself. This is a child with a Palestinian flag. It's like the only people who have never seen a Nazi film are Germans.
Yeah.
Halt! Halt!
Jesus Christ.
It's a child. It's a little kid.
With a flag.
Schnell! Schnell! Get on the train! Enough of your nonsense!
Look at that. Booking a kid. Putting a kid in the back of a police van for waving a flag.
Putting a kid in the back of a van for waving a chasing him down. A whole squad.
A whole squad of them.
Whole squad. Somehow, not a word of any of that made it into Vance's speech, even though he spent, I would say, at least half his speech specifically talking about repression of journalism, speech, and political organizing in Europe. At least half his speech, probably more, probably about 3/4 of his speech was spent on that. Here in November, German police detain 111 people during pro-Palestine protest. Again, and this was a week ago. This was, I think it was February 5th, and the event was February 15th, the Munich conference at which Vance spoke. So this was 1 week before. He spoke right at the opening about the tragic terrorist attack of the migrant, because that served a certain narrative. But this event, which happened right around the same time, this he said nothing about. They made chanting in Arabic illegal.
Only German and English allowed to protest. So you're not allowed to speak Arabic in public in Germany.
We do not need that guttural language here! That is not the tongue of the Übermensch!
Wir haben jetzt die Möglichkeit, den ehemaligen Versammlungsort zu tun Sie dies nicht. Wird die Polizei gegen Sie vorgehen, den Bereich räumen, Sie, wenn nötig, wegtragen, Ihre Identität feststellen.
Okay, all right. So we've taken a little tour around Europe of some of the, I would argue, and I think most reasonable people would agree, much more egregious offenses against freedom of speech than a guy who got arrested praying outside an abortion clinic. Not that I agree with that. I think that's terrible. That shouldn't happen. But I would argue Richard Medhurst getting arrested in 2 different countries for the crime of committing journalism is a much more clear and present danger to the values that Vance is claiming that he cares about. I'm surprised that so many very high-profile journalists who are often accused of having become right-wing MAGA Trump apologists missed that point. So many of them missed that point and are only talking about how he went after the Digital Services Act, which many reporters have done a good job exposing. It's terrible. We've done segments about that ourselves. It's just amazing to me that so many people who claim to really care about this subject did nothing but kind of aid and abet Vance's attempt to focus the conversation on speech on relatively trivial matters, frankly, cultural matters. Not that, again, we don't agree with that. We've done whole segments about the Digital Services Act and its implication. But I think we would all agree that the things you just saw are more egregious than anything that Vance talked about in that speech. And, you know, when you're talking about high-quality journalists, they know that. They know that. They certainly know about it, especially if you're a journalist. You'd want to take the opportunity, say you were on like Fox. You'd probably want to say something about Richard Medhurst or Kathy Wilkerson. You probably wouldn't just want to play along. But surprisingly, some people are doing that. Now, is it just in Europe that Vance is overlooking these assaults on speech and freedom of expression? No. Apparently, he's ignoring it in his own house. He's ignoring it in his own administration. FIRE, which has kind of taken the place of the ACLU in a lot of areas, although once in a while ACLU will still step up on things like this.
I mean, now that Trump is president, they're more like
now that Trump's president, exactly. Trump's threat to deport anti-Israel protesters is an attack on free speech. The president's executive order on anti-Semitism would make universities monitor students' constitutionally protected speech. Oh, that's right in his own administration. The president gave an executive order suppressing protesters. On Wednesday, Trump signed an executive order on anti-Semitism that directs leaders of agencies, including the Secretary of Homeland Security, to familiarize universities with grounds for inadmissibility for foreign nationals, quote, so that such institutions may monitor for and report activities by alien students and staff relevant to those grounds. Those reports will then lead to investigations and, if warranted, actions to remove such aliens, unquote. This development should worry all Americans, regardless of their position on the Israel-Hamas war. The order implies that universities should be monitoring and reporting students for scrutiny by immigration officials, including for speech that is protected by the First Amendment. It follows last week's executive order threatening denial of entry to foreign nationals or even deportation of those currently in the country who espouse hateful ideology. You understand, even if you're here on a foreign visa, you have First Amendment protections. You cannot legally be retaliated against for exercising the rights that all people in the country have. If you're in the country, you have those rights. However, didn't take much time for some of these Zionist fanatics at Columbia University to organize a WhatsApp group to start snitching on people and trying to get them deported for protesting or for expressing pro-Palestine views. Now, you might remember back in May, the House passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and this was not just Republicans. That was a 320 to 91 vote. So the bulk of the Democrats voted for it. Now, Schumer did not bring it up for a vote in the Senate, but it's been reintroduced. So what does it say? Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. IHRA's working definition reads, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. The definition includes, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g., by claiming that the state of Israel is a racist state, and drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Well, they're going to deport us, Keaton.
Yeah, exactly.
If universities fail to take punitive actions towards students who violate the definition, the Education Department could revoke federal research grants and other funding per Title VI of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, which prohibits the discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs that receive federal financial assistance. Proponents say the legislation would help crack down on anti-Semitism on campuses, while opponents say the definition is too broad and could chill free speech. Oh, do you think? So this did not get through the Senate, but it was just reintroduced on February 5th. Bipartisan House group reintroduces Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. Quote, there is no reason why this should not be the law of the land, said Representative Josh Gottheimer, a lead sponsor of the bill. It's time that everyone understood and there is no confusion what anti-Semitism is. So, you know, J.D. Vance is very concerned about free speech in Europe, although only a certain kind of free speech. He should maybe take a look at what's happening to free speech in America. This is very typical of this entire movement, and this is why I don't have a lot of patience for people who are going to gas it up and ignore the obvious. You don't have to be like a crackerjack detective to see what they're doing. They are focusing. It's the bizarro world version of the libs. The libs will focus all your attention in one direction in order to obscure what they don't want you to look at. Same thing here. They're going to focus you on the outrage of the old man in the driveway being arrested for a meme, and they're not going to say a word about Richard Medhurst. Now, I can understand a lot of people who are MAGA, who are not spending all of their time digging into things like this within their media ecosystem. They're not even hearing about people like Kathy Wilkerson or Richard Medhurst, so you're just going to hear that and say, winning, yeah, I'm getting tired of winning. If you know better than that, you really have no business helping them to create this false narrative that they're bringing back freedom of speech. They're not bringing back freedom of speech. They're bringing back the kind of speech that they like that was being suppressed by the liberal class, while tripling and quadrupling down on the kind of free speech that so many of us, including a lot of people who are bending the knee now to this narrative, have been screaming about for a year and a half.
Yeah, they are not for free speech. J.D. Vance does not support free speech. If he did support free speech, he would have mentioned Medhurst. He would have mentioned Wilkinson. Medhurst, a Christian, by the way. One thing he was keen to point out. He says, I'm a British Christian. He would have mentioned Wilkinson. He would have mentioned Ali from the Electronic Intifada. The fact that you have a blind spot when it comes to certain kinds of speech means you do not support free speech.
Right.
The whole point of supporting free speech is that there are no blind spots. You can't say, well, he supports free speech generally, but he has a blind spot when it comes to the, Israel-Gaza. Well, if you have a blind spot, then you don't support free speech at all.
Speech. Right.
You don't support it at all. So J.D. Vance does not support free speech at all. At all. He deserves no credit whatsoever. They don't want free speech. What they want is to reclaim the culture for Christianity because they think that the wokesters have usurped traditional values. And they want to reclaim, the society for Christian values. That is what they want to do. It has absolutely nothing, fuck all, to do with freedom of speech. And everybody with a brain in their head knows that. It's completely obvious.
Right.
It's the most obvious thing in the world.
Well, and you also have to only focus on instances of people with conservative views and conservative values having their speech suppressed to maintain the fiction that people like Kash Patel peddle, that this is all weaponized against the right. When, if you look at what's happened to pro-Palestine protesters, you could argue it is weaponized in a much more serious and damaging way against people who are actually on the left, not liberals, the left.
Right, exactly. And look at what happened here to the African people's, the African Socialist People's Party. And look at what happened with O'Malley. Look what happened with them. Now Tucker Carlson spoke out for them.
He did,
but you didn't have any prominent political figures speak out for them from either party. Nobody, literally nobody. Right. And so, it's very, very obvious that they only care about free speech in one direction, which means they don't care about it at all. And they don't deserve credit for this. They don't deserve J.D. Vance has nothing to say about the brutal crackdown on pro-Palestine speech, but we can give him credit for that. No, you can't. The whole point of free speech is that if it doesn't apply to everyone, there's no point applying it to anyone. That it's not freedom of speech. So no, you don't deserve credit. No, this was not a good speech. It was a bullshit speech by a bullshit fucking throw pillow fucking scumbag who only believes in free speech one way, which means you don't believe in it at all.
Well, we saw that on October 8th 2023.
Of course.
Right? All of a sudden, all the douchebag dialogue, intellectual, dark web, grifting scumbags, all of a sudden, they weren't for free speech anymore.
Right.
All of a sudden, they wanted to see the student protesters locked up. All of a sudden, they were woke. They're Islamists. They're being converted to Islam. It's so absurd. Some of the claims that were made to justify the hypocrisy of it.
Right.
No, we believe in freedom of speech, but they're being indoctrinated into Islam. So.
Right. He goes as far as to defend the guy who burned the Quran. Now, look, I think you should be able to burn a religious text. I think you should be able to burn a flag. Like, I'm a free speech absolutist in that way. Like, I don't think anybody should be prosecuted for that. But you could make a case that's like closer to the line of intimidation or something like that. Like, I wouldn't make that case, but I'm saying you could make a case that is closer to the line, certainly way closer to the line than a child waving a pro-Palestine flag. Like, what is more incendiary, burning a Quran or a child waving a pro-Palestine flag? Well, the answer in J.D. Vance's mind is the latter, because the latter offends his sensibilities, because he cares nothing about free speech, nothing at all.
Right. And
sick of hearing about this fucking speech. People tweeting it out like it's a Sermon on the Mount.
I mean, this is something that eventually I will probably before too long, I'm going to feel like I just have to do a video essay about this and let the chips fall where they may. It is tragic how many of our heroes are just falling on their knees and knob-gobbling this administration. It is really tragic. It's really tragic.
It's not only is it tragic, it's actually quite worrying, because, if there is actually going to be like any resistance to this, you would think it would be from this crop of people.
That's right. Especially people who have really made their careers on advocating for freedom of the press and freedom of speech. How on earth do you go and gas up a speech where J.D. Vance goes to Europe and only complains about niche identitarian persecutions of speech while completely ignoring the persecution of journalists? If you are a journalist, and a journalist who has really built your reputation on fighting for freedom of speech and freedom of journalism, how do you aid and abet this? I mean, the kindest interpretation is it's tough being on the outside looking in. It wears people down. That's an old story. And if you feel it's a lot better to feel like you're winning, right? Like you're getting some control. It's particularly if you start to feel like you're getting some kind of access, you're getting a seat at the table. And the price for that seat at the table is, if you sit down and you look at what the Daily Wire is reporting, and you look at what you're reporting, and you're reporting the same thing, same way, same perspective, same blind spot, well, what did you win? You didn't beat the enemy, you became the enemy.
Yep. Agreed.
Please clap.